William Whitehead became Vicar of Stoneground in the year 1741. The annals of his incumbency were doubtless short and simple. They have not survived. In his day were no newspapers to collect gossip, no parish magazines to record the simple events of parochial life. One event, however, of greater moment then than now, is recorded in two places. Vicar Whitehead failed in health after 23 years of work and journeyed to Bath in what his monument calls the vain hope of being restored. The duration of the visit is unknown. It is reasonable to suppose he made the journey in the summer. It is certain that by the month of November his physician told him to lay aside all hope of recovery. That was when the thoughts of the patient turned to the comfortable straggling vicarage he had left at Stoneground, in which he had hoped to end his days. He prayed that his successor might be as happy there as he had been himself. Setting his affairs in order, as became one who had but a short time to live, he executed a will bequeathing to the vicars of Stoneground for ever the small plot of ground he had recently purchased, because it lay next to the vicarage garden, and he added to the bequest his library of books. Within a few days, William Whitehead was gathered to his fathers. The house he loved but never again saw was taken down 40 years later and rebuilt by Vicar James Deavy. The garden, with Vicar Whitehead's plot of land and other adjacent lands, was opened out and planted somewhat before 1850 by Vicar Robert Towerson. The aspect of everything has changed, but in a convenient chamber on the first floor of the present vicarage, the library of Vicar Whitehead stands very much as he used it and loved it, and as he bequeathed it to his successors forever. He would have but a dull imagination who could sit in the chamber amidst all these books without ever being carried back 180 years into the past, to the time when the newest of them left the printer's hands. Of those into whose possession the books have come, some have doubtless loved them more and some less, and they passed some century and a half after William Whitehead's death into the hands of Mr. Bachel. Mr. Bachel loved them as a father loves his children. He lived alone and had few domestic cares to distract his mind. He was able, therefore, to enjoy to the full what Vicar Whitehead had enjoyed so long before him. During many a long summer evening he would sit poring over long-forgotten books. There were other times also at which Mr. Bachel would use the books. Not being a sound sleeper, for book-loving men seldom are, he elected to use as a bedroom one of the two chambers which opened at either side into the library. This arrangement enabled him to beguile many a sleepless hour among the books, and in view of these nocturnal visits, he kept a candle standing in a sconce about the desk, and matches always ready to his hand. There was one disadvantage in this close proximity of his bed to the library. Owing apparently to some defect in the fittings of the room, there could be heard, in the stillness of the night, exactly such sounds as might arise from a person moving about among the books. Visitors using the other adjacent room would often remark at breakfast that they had heard their host in the library at 1 or 2 o'clock in the morning, when in fact he had not left his bed. Invariably Mr. Bachel allowed them to suppose that he had been where they thought him. He disliked idle controversy, and was unwilling to afford an opening for supernatural talk. He conjectured that the window sashes or the doors or something were defective. On Christmas Eve, in the year 1907, Mr. Bachel, who would like to have slept well in view of the labours of Christmas Day, lay hopelessly awake. He exhausted all the known devices for courting sleep, and at the end found himself wider awake than ever. A brilliant moon shone into his room. There was a light wind blowing, and the sounds in the library were more than usually suggestive of a person moving about. He heard the clock strike midnight, and having now lost all hope of falling asleep, he rose from his bed, got into a large dressing gown, and passed into the library with the intention of reading himself sleepy if he could. In spite of the moonlight, the library was in darkness. Groping along to where the table stood, Mr. Bachel felt over its surface for the matches which usually lay there. He found, however, that the table was cleared of everything. He raised his right hand, therefore, in order to feel his way to a shelf where the matches were sometimes mislaid, and at that moment, whilst his hand was in mid-air, the matchbox was gently placed into it. Such an incident could hardly fail to disturb him, and Mr. Bachel cried, "Who is there?" Somewhat nervously. There was no answer. He struck a match, looked hastily round the room, and found it empty as usual. There was everything, that is to say, that he was accustomed to see, but no other person than himself. That is not quite accurate, however, to say that it was in its usual state. Upon the desk lay a book that he had certainly not put there. It was quite his invariable practice to replace his books upon the shelves after using them, and what we may call his library habits were precise and methodical. A book out of place like this was not only an offence against good order, but a sign that his privacy had been intruded upon. With some surprise, therefore, he lit the candle standing ready in the sconce, and stepped forward to examine the book, not sorry, in the disturbed condition in which he was, to have an occupation found for him. The book proved to be one with which he was unfamiliar, and this made it certain that some other hand than his had removed it from its place. The title was The Complete Gardener, by Monsieur de la Quintine, made English by John Evelyn, Esquire. It was not a work in which Mr. Bachel felt any great interest. It consisted of diverse reflections on various parts of husbandry, doubtless entertaining enough, but too deliberate and discursive for practical purposes. He had certainly never used it, and, growing restless now in mind, said to himself that some boy having the freedom of the house had taken it down from its place in the hope of finding pictures. Yes, Mr. Bachel had, however, come to read, and habit was too strong with him to be wholly set aside. Leaving The Complete Gardener on the desk, he turned round to the shelves to find more congenial reading. Hardly had he done this when he was startled by a sharp rap upon the desk behind him, followed by a rustling of paper. He turned quickly and saw the volume lying open. In obedience to the instinct of the moment, he sought a natural cause for what had happened. Perhaps the wind could have opened the book. Yes, but the wind was very light. Mr. Bachel approached the desk again and stood over the book with increasing perturbation of mind, for he still thought of the matchbox. He looked upon the open page. Without much reason beyond that he felt constrained to do something, he read the words of the half-completed sentence at the turn of the page. At dead of night he left the house and passed into the solitude of the garden. But he read no more, nor did he give himself the trouble of discovering whose midnight wandering was being described, although the habit was singularly like one of his own. He was in no condition for reading now, and, turning his back upon the volume, he slowly paced the length of the chamber, wondering at that which has come to pass. He reached the opposite end of the chamber and was in the act of turning, when again he heard the rustling of paper, and by the time he had faced around, he saw the leaves of the book again turning over. In a moment the volume lay at rest, open in another place, and there was no further movement as he approached it. To make sure he had not been deceived, he read again the words as they entered the page. The author was following a not uncommon practice of the time, and throwing common speech into forms suggested by Holy Writ. It read, "So dig, that ye may obtain." This passage, to which Mr. Bachel seemed reprehensible in its levity, excited at once his interest and disapproval. He was prepared to read more, but this time he was not allowed. Before his eye could pass beyond the passage already cited, the leaves of the book slowly turned again, and he then saw but a termination of 5 words. The words were, "To the north, and Ilex." These 3 passages, in which he saw no meaning and no connection, began to entangle themselves in his mind. He found himself repeating them in different orders, now beginning with one, now with another. Any further attempts at reading seemed to be impossible, and he was in no mind for any more experiences of the unaccountable. What he did, therefore, was to blow out the candle and return to his moonlit bedroom. He put on more clothing, and then he went downstairs with the object of going out of doors. It was not unusual for Mr. Bachel to walk about his garden at night time. This form of exercise had often, after a wakeful hour, sent him back to his bed refreshed and ready for sleep. The convenient access to the garden at such times lay through his study, whose French windows opened on a short flight of steps, and upon these he now paused for a moment to admire the snow-like appearance of the lawns, bathed as they were in the moonlight. As he paused, he heard the city clock strike the half-hour after midnight, and he could not forbear repeating aloud, "At dead of night he left the house, and passed into the solitude of the garden." It was solitary enough. At intervals the screech of an owl seemed to emphasize the solitude by drawing attention to it, and then leaving it in possession of the night. He turned his face northwards, and saw a tree, beautifully outlined against the sky. His breath caught at the sight, not because the tree was unfamiliar. Mr. Bachel knew all his trees. But what he had seen to the north was an ilex. To the north, an ilex. Mr. Bachel knew not what to make of it all. He had walked into the garden hundreds of times, and often seen the ilex, but the words out of the Complete Gardener now seemed to be pursuing him in a way that made him almost afraid. His temperament, however, has been said already, was phlegmatic. It was commonly said, and Mr. Bachel approved the verdict, while he condemned its inexactness, that his nerves were made of fiddle-string. So he braced himself and set afresh upon his walk into the silent garden. He usually passed the ilex at the beginning of his perambulation, and so would pass it now, but he did not pass it. A small discovery, as he reached it, annoyed and disturbed him. His gardener, as careful and punctilious as himself, never failed to house all his tools at the end of a day's work. Yet here, under the ilex, standing upright in moonlight, was a spade. Mr. Bachel's second thought was one of relief. After his extraordinary experiences in the library, something quite commonplace would act sedatively, and he determined to carry the spade to the tool-house. The soil was quite dry, and the surface even a little frozen, so Mr. Bachel left the path, walked up to the spade, and would have drawn it towards him. But the spade would not be moved. First with one hand, then with both he tried to raise it, and it still stood firm. Mr. Bachel, of course, attributed this to the frost, slight as it was. He was about to leave it and continue his walk when the remaining words of the complete gardener seemed rather to utter themselves than to await his will. "So dig that ye may obtain." Mr. Bachel's power of independent action now deserted him. He took the spade, which no longer resisted, and began to dig. 5 spadefuls and no more, he said aloud. "This is all foolishness." 4 spadefuls of earth he then raised and spread out before him in the moonlight. There was nothing unusual to be seen, nor did Mr. Bachel decide what he would look for, whether coins, jewels, documents in canisters, or weapons. In point of fact, he dug against what he deemed to be his better judgment, and expected nothing. He spread before him the 5th and final spade of earth, not quite without result, but with no result that was at all sensational. The earth contained a bone. Mr. Bachel's knowledge of anatomy was sufficient to show him that it was a human bone. He identified it, even by moonlight, as the radius, a bone of the forearm. He removed the earth from it with his thumb. Such a discovery might be thought worthy of more than the very ordinary interest Mr. Bachel showed. As a matter of fact, the presence of a human bone was easily to be accounted for. Recent excavations within the church had caused the upturning of numerous bones, which had been collected and reverently buried. But an earth-stained bone is easily overlooked, and this radius had obviously found its way into the garden, with some of the earth brought out from the church. Mr. Bachel was glad, rather than regretful, at this termination to his adventure. He was once more provided with something to do. The reinterment of bones, such as this, had been his constant care, and he decided at once to restore the bone to consecrated earth. The time seemed opportune. The eyes of the curious were closed in sleep. He himself was alert and wakeful. The spade remained by his side, and the bone in his hand. So he betook himself there and then to the churchyard. By the still generous light of the moon, he found a place where the earth yielded to his spade, and within a few minutes the bone was laid decently to earth, some 18 inches deep. The city clocks struck 1 as he finished. The whole world seemed asleep, and Mr. Bachel slowly returned to the garden with his spade. As he hung it in its accustomed place, he felt stealing over him the welcome desire to sleep. He walked quietly onto the house and ascended to his room. It was now dark. The moon had passed on and left the room in shadow. He lit a candle and, before undressing, passed into the library. He had an irresistible curiosity to see the passages in John Evelyn's book which had so strangely adapted themselves to the events of the past hour. In the library, a final surprise awaited him. The desk upon which the book had lain was empty. The complete gardener stood in its place on the shelf. And then Mr. Bachel knew that he had handled a bone of William Whitehead in response to its owner's own entreaty.